Now, do you ever struggle knowing what to get somebody for their birthday, or with Christmas just around the corner, you just don't know what to get? Well, in this week's video tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to make a cake that looks just like a present. Now, I really hope you enjoyed this video tutorial. If you do, then make sure you give it a like. And if you haven't already and you want to see more video tutorials like this, then make sure you hit the subscribe button. Okay, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do in order to prepare my present cake is work on the cake itself. Now, you can bake individual layers in a square tin. I've actually baked my cake as a tray bake, and this measures around 1 inch in height. So I'm going to trim this down. Now, each layer of my cake is going to be 5 inches by 5 inches. Depending on how many people your cake needs to feed, you can create a slightly larger cake. Now, I have placed my cake in the fridge for a few hours to make it nice and chilled, so it's a lot easier to carve. I want my cake to be just under 5 inches in height so that when we fill it with our filling, it ends up as a 5-inch cube. So now that's been trimmed down, I have 4 layers of cake, which are just over 1 inch in height each. For the filling and covering of my cake, I've created some milk chocolate ganache. Now, I've used 300 ml of cream to 600 grams of milk chocolate, and I will put a link in the description below to the recipe and a video showing how I make my chocolate ganache. I'm then going to start filling between each layer of cake with that ganache and giving it a nice crumb coat on the outside. Now, all the crumb coat is going to do is just lock in any loose crumbs around the edge so that when we come to put on our final coating of ganache, it's nice and smooth. Now, a square cake can be slightly trickier than a round cake to get smooth just because we've got these corners. Now, when smoothing down the sides of our crumb coat, I'm going to go in with my metal scraping tool. Now, this is quite a long one so that I know that it's going to go above the height of the cake. And the main thing is to make sure you keep the bottom edge of your scraper always directly on your board. This is going to mean as you scrape down the sides, you're creating a 90-degree angle, keeping your cube nice and square. Now, when smoothing down the sides, I want to run my smoothing tool from one edge to the other, stopping before I come to the other side so that I don't pull any of that ganache off. I'm then going to bring my scraper to that edge and just pull back slightly, and then going in with my offset spatula as I would if I was working on the top of a round cake, and I'm going to pull that ganache into the center. Once you're happy with your crumb coat that we're starting to get that cube shape, I'm going to pop this in the fridge for that ganache to firm up. Now, once your cake is ready to come out of the fridge and for us to apply our last layer of ganache, you can either do it in exactly the same way, so just using your offset spatula and going in with your smoothing tool. But if you do find it quite tricky to get those sharp edges on the side, I'm going to be using a cake card. So I've got a cake card here which is 5 inches, and this one is actually just slightly over 5 inches, so it's slightly bigger than my cake, which is going to allow for a small amount of space for me to add the ganache around the edge. This is just a cake card that I've got from a cake decorating store. Now, if you can't find a square one, you could always cut this out of the center of a circle board, but you just want to make sure you've got a nice straight edge on all the sides. I then cut out a small piece of parchment paper which is exactly the same size as my cake board. Taking my cake out of the fridge, apply a thin layer of my ganache over the top, working it into those corners and just allowing that to overhang. If you're using a cake board or a cake card, you can stick this directly to the top, but I do find it can get slightly messy, which is why I'm just using a piece of double-sided tape, sticking down my piece of parchment paper, making sure that it's in the center and we get a slight overhang all the way around. And then going in with my ganache, just adding a layer onto the outside, pulling it up so it meets that cake board that we've got on the top. Now, I've put one of these on the top. Some people do put one on the bottom, but as long as you keep the bottom edge of your scraper on your board, that top board is going to allow you to get the shape of your cube. So again, starting on one side, I'm going to run that scraper along the edge, using that cake board as a guide, coming to the edge and just pulling back as we did before. So once you're completely happy, I'm going to pop this in the fridge for the last time. Now I'm going to leave the cake board on the top just until that ganache has firmed up in the fridge. I can then use my offset spatula to lift off the cake board and the piece of parchment paper and just neaten up any of those edges. Running my spatula along the edge, taking off any excess. So there we have our square cake all ready to cover in fondant. Take some water that I've mixed with a small amount of icing sugar just to make a glue, brushing that over the sides of my cake. I've then got a ball of blue fondant that I've coloured using the Wilton Azure Blue or the Royal Blue. Now I do find if you're using quite a lot of colour, I always try and leave the fondant to one side for a few hours after all that colour has been added, as I've had to knead it quite a lot, which has warmed that fondant up. So just wrap it in some cling film and leave it to one side just to get back to room temperature, so it's a lot easier to use to cover the cake. Once the fondant is rolled out large enough to cover my cake, I'm going to drape that over the top, smooth down that top edge as you would if you were covering a round cake. I'm then going to work on my corners first, going in just lightly pushing down that fondant on those corners. I can then go in as you would with a normal cake, just lifting up that fondant slightly and pushing it onto the side. So we're just smoothing down each of the 4 sides, making sure that all those pleats are smoothed out. Now I'm covering my cake in one go, but if you do struggle getting the sides nice and smooth on a square cake, you can also use a paneling effect. So just by cutting out squares that are the same size as your sides and sticking them directly onto your cake. Once my fondant is stuck on and it's looking nice and smooth, I'm going to go in with my paddle smoothers, just working my way around the cake, smoothing down those sides and those edges. Now on the side, I'm doing this exactly the same way as I would on the top edge of a cake. So holding one of the paddles and going in, just getting that nice crisp line. Once I'm happy with how that's looking, I'm then going to finish it off with my flexi smoothers, and these just allow me to go in and really work on those edges. So there we have our cube cake. Now I want this to look like a present box that has a lid on the top. So I'm going to roll out some of my leftover blue fondant into a long thin strip. Now I know that each of my sides is around 5 inches, so this strip needs to be around 20 inches long. I want to keep it quite thick so that it looks like the lid of a box. I've rolled it out to a thickness of around 5 millimeters, and I'm using a ruler that is 1.5 inches in diameter. You then want to carefully wind that up, bring it back in your cake. I'm going to apply some edible glue along that top edge, starting from the back. Carefully push that on so that it's level with the top. Now before I cut off the excess, I'm going to smooth that onto the cake, making sure that the bottom has remained level. Just putting that up to meet the top. I can then go back in with my smoothers and work on this top edge and also these corners. So I want these corners to match the ones that we have on the side of the box. Now if you have any areas on your cake, maybe in those corners where you've joined the extra band, where you have a slight gap and you just can't get these quite right and you want to fill this, what you can do is take a small ball of your blue fondant and mix this together with some water until you get a paste. So this paste will be in exactly the same colour as your fondant. You can then use your offset spatula and just take a really small amount of that and just fill in any gaps, just wiping off the excess. Now it will be slightly shiny when you put it on, so you want to allow that to dry and then you can buff that in with your flexi smoothers. For the board that the cake is going to go on, I've got a 9-inch square drum board. So this one just measures 1 centimetre in height. I'm going to roll out some white fondant until it's large enough to cover my board. Once that's large enough, I'm going to take some water and apply this to the top of my board so that my fondant will stick. With square boards, as well as going over the surface, you want to make sure that you're applying some right to those corners So I'm just lifting that over the top, smoothing it down, going in with a pizza cutter, rolling towards that corner. I can then go back in and do the same, but going the other way. This is going to mean as I'm working my way around the board, I'm never pulling that fondant away from the corner. I'm then adding a length of satin ribbon around the edge. I can then transfer the cake over. Okay, so for the bow that's going to go on the top of my cake, I've got this ball of modelling paste. Now I've mixed 145 grams of gum paste, or in this case Squire's floral paste, with 25 grams of fondant so it doesn't dry as quickly. Now I want my bow to look like it's made of ribbon, so I'm going to roll this out as thinly as possible, so around 1 millimeter in thickness. I'm then cutting out 2 large rectangles. Now these are 6 inches by 3 inches each, and a slightly smaller piece, which is 1.5 inches by 3 inches. Starting with one of the larger pieces, and I'm going to flip this over so that the outside is facing down. Pop a small amount of edible glue down one edge, and I've also got some cotton wool pads. You can also use cotton wool balls or just some kitchen paper. Place that in the center of my bow, and this is just going to help it keep its shape. Pull that bow over so that the 2 sides meet. I then want to create shape with my bow, so I'm going to pull those 2 ends together to create a kind of triangle or diamond shape. Now I don't want my bow to sit flat on the center of my cake, I want it to sit upright, so instead of letting it dry laying down, I'm going to push that cotton wool slightly in and just push my finger in to create some shape, just to bend that round. I'm then going to do exactly the same to the other side. Now in the center, where the 2 halves meet, I'm going to push those together. Now, just while I do the center of the bow, I'm going to lie my bow back down, just making sure that I've got a line along the bottom. I can then work on the smaller piece that's going to be the knot in the center. And on both edges, I'm going to turn this over, turn it back and forward on itself until we get a strip that looks like it could be a knot. So I'm going to place that on, lightly lift up those 2 halves and wrap that around the back. I can then trim off the excess on the bottom and re-stand my bow up. Now I'm taking that leftover modelling paste and I'm going to roll that out until we get another long thin strip. Use my ruler as a guide, and this is going to be ribbon ends. So cut these around 3.5 inches each. Now if you wanted to create a slightly different bow design, I do have some more bow tutorials, so I will put links in the description below so you can check those out. There's one that's more of a Christmassy bow, and you've got the classic loop bow. Now with these 2 ends, I'm going to cut a triangle out each side, and I want to create quite a lot of movement to these, but making sure that I keep this bottom end flat. And I'm going to leave these to one side with my bow so that we can add them to the top of the cake. I've then got some fondant, which I've coloured in exactly the same colour as my modelling paste. We'll roll this out until it's around 1 to 2 millimeters in thickness, and I can create some ribbon to go up the side of my box. So first cutting a straight line along the bottom of my cake, and again using the width of my ruler as a guide. Pop a line of edible glue along the front and along the top. Bringing in one of my strips, place that in the center of the cake and just pull that all the way across. Now I'm not pulling it tight to the edge, I'm leaving a slight gap so it creates a little shadow, just as you would have if you draped some ribbon round. Going in at the bottom, slightly pushing that in with my Dresden tool so it looks like it's wrapping from the bottom. Using my craft knife, I'm then just taking off excess, so those pieces of ribbon lie flat on the top of my cake. Once it's dry, I can then bring back in my bow and remove those pieces of cotton wool and work out where I want to place it. So I want it slightly off center on the top of my present, and I've also got my ribbon tails. I'm happy with that. I'm going to lift that up with some edible glue, glue down those ends. Now, because the bottom of my ribbon isn't completely flat, I'm going to use a piece of fondant in the same colour just for that to sit on. Now, the last thing I'm going to do to finish off my cake is to create a tag or a label for the side. So I've got a small ball of my fondant and I'm going to roll this out until it's around 2 to 3 millimeters in thickness. Using my craft knife, I'm going to cut out a rectangle, which is around 2.5 inches by 1.5 inches. At one end, I'm then going to taper this down. So I'm just going to cut off corner. I've got a piping tip here and this is a number 12 and this just has a circle opening at the end. I'm going to use this to cut out a piece which is going to give me my tag shape. To create the lettering on my tag, I'm going to be using the new frosting set by Sweet Stamp. And I'm just taking some fondant and I'm going to pull out the letters for the name that's going to go on the tag. So in this case, I'm just using Alex. I'm then going to take my small round pickup pad and my guide, lay out those letters, take my pickup pad and just pick that up. And this is just going to create a stamp for me to use on my tag. I'm then going to take my stamp and just lightly push that into the surface of my fondant. Now I'm adding a small amount of my violet food gel with a little bit of black to give me a dark purple. I've then mixed in some alcohol or some dip-in solution to make it into an edible paint, and using a really thin paintbrush, I'm just going in, just filling in those letters. Now I do have a code for you to get 10% off across the whole of the Sweet Stamp website. All you have to do is add Cakes by Linz at the checkout, and I will put all the details and the links in the description below. And once you're done, there we have our little tag to add onto the side of our cake. So I've got a really small amount of grey fondant. Roll this into a really thin sausage so it looks like a strand of cotton. Now I want my tag to come slightly off of the cake at a slight angle. So in order to give me something to stick it onto, I'm going to use a small ball of that blue just hidden behind. Take in the strand of grey, thread that through, hold that in place until that glue has stuck, and then tuck that grey underneath that bow, chopping off any excess. Here we have the finished present cake that looks like a gift box all wrapped up with a pretty bow on the top. I really hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial and will enjoy making this cake for some of your friends or maybe your loved ones. If you have enjoyed the video, as always, don't forget to give it a like, and if you'd like to see more videos like this and you haven't already, then you can subscribe to the Cakes by Linz YouTube channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell and next to the subscribe button, as this will just alert you every time we upload a new video. Now, if you want to make this cake yourself, I will put a link in the description below to all the tools that I've used throughout today's video. So until next time, bye!